This podcast is brought to you by sarahraven.com, which is home to everything you need for a truly beautiful and productive garden. You'll also find great and essential gardening kit and stylish, lovely things to have in your house to bring the outside indoors, all inspired by the garden and the house being tied together. There's also plenty of garden inspiration, how-to videos and specialist growing guides. So head over to sarahraven.com today to discover even more. Welcome to Grow, Cook, Eat, Arrange, the podcast of me, Sarah Raven, and roving guests, including Adam Nicolson, my husband. And he is joining me today because on the 4th of May, we will have been here for 30 years.
Here at Perch Hill.
Here at Perch Hill.
It's nice to be invited in to the studio.
Oh, good. So I just thought it might be nice to, for those of you who don't know, to have a bit of a recap on the history of why we came here, what we wanted to do when we got here, and what we have done since we've been here. And so it's going to be, bounce between us, I guess. So Adam will talk a little bit about the farm and about biodiversity and nature, and I will, of course, talk more about the development of the garden. So, 30 years at Perch Hill.
30 years at Perch Hill, and it does feel like a hell of a long time, doesn't it?
Yes, I can't imagine living anywhere else now.
It doesn't. I mean, people say, time whizzes by, but honestly, I feel, we've been here for forever and ever and ever.
And you've fallen in and out of love with it at some points.
Yes. Well, okay. So if we start at the beginning, 30 years ago, we were living in London together, in West London, in your house. And it was a lovely house, but I couldn't bear living in London. I couldn't bear the feeling of constraint. And I remember saying to someone, it was like living in one of those boxes you get rented wine glasses in. When you rent wine glasses for a party and every little glass is squeezed into its little rectangular upright box. That's what London felt like to me.
And still does, to be honest.
And still does.
You still feel that.
And so the great, great, great thing about living out in the country is the kind of horizontal extent. It just stretches wide. And I always have felt completely liberated by that. Both liberated and kind of attached.
Yeah.
So anyway, you found it, didn't you? You found this place one day.
I did, actually. It's a nice story that's worth recapping, which is that Adam had 3 boys from a previous marriage, and we already had our first baby, who was then 6 or 7 months old. And I had managed to get a transfer, or I knew I could transfer to out of London hospital when I was training to be a doctor. And Adam's father lived over at Sissinghurst, and where Adam had been brought up, which is 35 minutes away from here. So we started looking around here because he was already in his 80s, I think in his 80s or late 70s. And it was nice for us to be near him to help take care of him a little bit. And so we looked over near where he lived and we didn't find anything. Adam is very specific in his requirements, and he didn't want to have anything that had been sort of pre-done. He wanted a make up and do, or whatever the new phrase is.
A doer-upper.
A doer-upper, that's the phrase, sorry.
Sounds like Dua Lipa.
But he didn't want to be in a village. He wanted to be in the countryside.
You're making it sound as if I was making all the decisions.
Well, you were.
I think you are quite famous for being a decision maker. Anyway, together.
Okay, so basically it needed to be, in the end, a farm of some description or somewhere out in the countryside anyway. And of course, in our part of the world, as in many parts of the world now, most of the properties in the countryside, even 30 years ago, had already been divided, and the oast house had been sold from the farmhouse, had been sold from the barn, etc. Anyway, I came to look at rather an amazing Georgian observatory at the top of the lane here, and it was the second time we'd viewed it, but we had already 4 children, and it just wasn't big enough. I realised that we weren't going to squeeze in. There just weren't enough rooms for enough beds. And so I went for a walk, and I said to the people who owned the house at the time, the observatory at the time, where before I drive back to London with my baby, I'm going to take her for a walk in the pushchair. Where would you walk if you were here on a nice day? And I can't remember what time. I think it was summer then. Yes, it was. It was summer the previous year. And he said, I would walk down Willingford Lane. So off I walked with the pushchair down Willingford Lane and came past Perch Hill. And there was a very sweet, very kind of simple for sale sign, handwritten, hand-painted. But on the back, it did have a number in the village of where you could inquire. And so I pushed the buggy back up the hill, got in the car, went to the village, and it was actually an antique shop, oddly, and a sort of tea room that was the number in the high street. So I went in and I said, was it for sale? Yes, it was. Anyway, a long time later, 9 months later, we eventually bought the place.
Well, I remember coming to see it first. You were very excited. You rang me up in London, so I came down, and it was an absolute wreck. There were concrete everywhere, disintegrating sheds, plastic corrugated roofs, and a herd of terrifying geese. Do you remember?
I do remember the geese.
And so I said, really? And you said, come and have a look over here. And so we went for a walk in the fields. And it was the fields that were so beautiful. Little hedged, old Sussex weald fields, few acres each. Not very flowery, but buttercuppy and sorrel, and a really wonderful feeling of it being ancient countryside. And that's what swung me. I mean, I really didn't care about the house. I couldn't even stand up in the house. The ceilings were too low.
No, but I think it was a June day, and they had there's a big Inglenut fireplace in the middle of the house, and they had the fire lit, and we sat by the fire in 2 wooden chairs, and that felt very settled place, a very old place, again, like the fields around it. And that, as the more domestic of us maybe, was also what settled it for me, is I felt very calm there, very grounded, very earthed, and it felt like it had very good karma.
And it was just tremendously exciting coming here. We arrived May the 4th, 1994. And I remember walking around that evening, really unable to believe that we could call this place our home now. It was just like an absolute gift from nothing. The wonderful May, so wood anemones and bluebells and all the garlic in flower still, maybe.
Yeah.
The leaves, the trees just in new leaf. It was just like complete heaven.
Yeah.
I remember it now with absolutely raging nostalgia.
I remember the whole thing was blue. So the garden, which wasn't so much of a garden, there was a goldfish pond and a couple of fruit trees and a few beds, and all of them were completely blue with forget-me-not, self-seeded forget-me-not. And then the sky was blue on the day, and the wood was blue with bluebells, which of course come earlier now because 30 years we've seen climate change. But it just it was extraordinary. The whole place was blue.
And chaotic.
And pretty chaotic. And always
there was a time where we had to carry a different pair of shoes to the car because the mud was so thick outside the door between where we could get a car to and where the back door was, that by the time we got to the car, we were totally slobbered up. So that's been something we've done, essentially, isn't it? That we have made it habitable in a way it wasn't.
Well, how I would see it is that we didn't have enough money to do much to the house. Yeah. So we concentrated whatever we could afford on the outside and the garden. And that was a sort of irony, actually. For 15 or 20 years after owning it, we actually hadn't made the house suitable for us because it was too much of a capital investment. So we just kept biting off smaller chunks, which would make one garden here. Or, for instance, when we did have enough money, we restored the Oast house, And we did that before we did anything to the farmhouse.
Yes, and you were working as a doctor and I was working in the newspapers. So we had this wonderful woman, Anna Chini, come to look after our girls. And after a few years, I said to Anna, why did you come and work for us? And she said, because I just felt so sorry for those girls having to put up with you two and living in such utter chaos. So we have to thank Anna Chini for any coherence our life now has. But that was the feeling and the quality of the first few years.
Yeah.
And then at the end of the 90s, my father got ill. And when he was ill, we went to live at Sissinghurst with him. And he died in, I think, 2004. And we stayed on afterwards. And I really lived at Sissinghurst for those something like 8 or 9 years. And really, Perch Hill rather faded from view in my life. We both tried to make big changes to the way Sissinghurst operated and got the farm up and running and the restaurant chain and all kinds of things. Anyway, that was the focus for a while. And so only in, I think about when, 2010 or 11 or something like that, one day we were coming back from a party in the West Country and various things had not gone right at Sissinghurst. And on the way back in the car, Sarah said, shall we go to Perch Hill? There'd be some students living here. And they just left. And so the house was empty. And you said, shall we just go to Perch Hill? Wouldn't it be nice? And so we literally, instead of turning left to Sissinghurst, turned right to Perch Hill and arrived and found a place probably in even worse condition than when we'd first arrived. And it felt like a moment of absolute liberty. I remember nothing worked. We cooked on the fire. There were no telephones. And it just felt like an act of pure freedom. And,
but
yes.
If I could interrupt there.
Yes.
In the meantime, over that period when you were very much booked into Sissinghurst, I was actually developing the garden here. So I just want to talk about that briefly because we did come back to a garden. It's true that the house and the buildings were in not the greatest state, but the garden, I'd devoted almost all my time of that first 20 years to understanding the principle of growing for production. So whether it was cut flowers or vegetables, salads and herbs, I really concentrated my energies on learning about cut and come again plants, which if you're a grazer, if you're an animal, you graze them off and they grow back, and you graze them off again and they grow back again. And so I became the grazer, which is I was picking the harvest, whether it be of salad rocket or cosmos, and got to understand about how to create the most auxiliary buds, which are what gives you a cut and come again plant. And that is absolutely the foundation stone of this garden to this day, that a high proportion of the plants that we grow in any one area are not perennials, shrubs and evergreens and trees, but actually they tend to be annuals for either eating or for picking.
So then our return then began a new phase, really, didn't it?
Yeah.
So first phase, this kind of chaotic, young married, muddy life with the children, which was really lovely in retrospect. Those lovely evenings in the hayfields, I remember. Then the time when I was away at Sissinghurst largely, and you were doing that, what you just said. And then the third one is really, I think, kind of getting it in order is what I think of it as. So,
and we're still in that.
Oh my God, are we? But increasingly feeling, for me anyway, that this place, which we've landed in absolutely arbitrarily, really, has become the center of my life, that I think that almost everything I value is here now. And the way that has kind of come through in the gardening is you giving much more attention now to what people call biodiversity nowadays.
Yes.
Birds and bees and bugs and all kinds of invertebrates, and just trying to ensure that the garden and, in fact, the farm are both kind of absolute engines for a rich, many-layered natural life. And as and I have to say, I am so happy that all of that is part of my life. I would feel life incredibly diminished without that going on around us here.
Yeah, and I think some people do find it quite challenging in that there's a little untidy about it still. I mean, hopefully we're getting a bit tidier. But I think that there is always the balance as a gardener and an interior decorator, and whether you're inside or outside, the balance of abundance versus structure, sort of chaos versus tidiness. All these things are a balancing act, and you can definitely tip too far one way or too far the other. But I feel, as well as colour and abundance being absolute cornerstones of Perch Hill as a place, I also feel biodiversity, and with that, light, gentle corsets from woodland structures are absolutely, for me, if I think of the epitome of Perch Hill, it's a walkway with sweet peas, but growing up arches of our own hazel, ideally with silver birch harvested from just nearby, or similarly, runner beans like Blue Lake climbing, tumbling out over where we're picking the flowers. The birds are getting the nectar. We're also eating the beans, but also this thing is loose and lovely. And the fact that we're in the most wooded county of England and that we're actually using the woodland products in the garden, for me, is incredibly important. And another, for me, the sort of fourth leg, really, to hold the absolute lack of structure into something that has the right balance between chaos and abundance.
So well done. That's all I can say to you.
Well, that is good.
Because it is, in the summer here now, it's lovely on these open days when people come, and you really do see people walking around open-mouthed at what you've done here.
Well, I'm not sure.
No, they do. I've seen people.
Anyway,
it's a rather odd sight. You see people walking up and down the paths with open mouths.
Well, it's a beauty of a kind, and it's a beauty of, that some people love and some people don't love. Anyway, 30 years at Perch Hill. We will have been here, and we will be celebrating it at the beginning of May, and I hope that some of you come to join us. Thanks for listening to our recap on 30 years at Perch Hill. And next week, it's Arthur Parkinson, and he's going to be interviewing Beth Gregg from Claverton Cloches, because he felt so inspired by a visit there that he really wanted to sort of chat to her and for you all to hear about it. So listen then. You can find more information, photos and advice sheets on all the plants and recipes we talk about on this podcast by heading to the show notes or at sarahraven.com/podcast.